Imagine a city, a real, functioning city. It has a movie theater, a church, a barber shop, and enough hot showers to keep everyone smelling surprisingly fresh. Now, imagine this entire city is buried 30 feet beneath the most inhospitable ice sheet on Earth, powered by a portable nuclear reactor. And strictly off-limits too. Well, basically everyone. No, this isn't the rebel base on Hoth. This was real life in 1959. To understand why the US Army decided to become professional moles, we have to look at the vibe of the late 52nds. The Cold War was heating up, and everyone was terrified. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik, which basically meant they could put a metal ball in space, so they could definitely drop a nuke on your backyard barbecue. The US military needed a strategic advantage, and they realized something important. Looking at a flat map is for losers. If you look at a globe, the shortest distance between Washington, D.C. and Moscow isn't across the ocean, it's right over the top of the world, the Arctic, and sitting right in the middle of that frozen highway is Greenland. But the Army didn't just want to build a base on Greenland. They came up with a plan so insane, it sounds like it was written by a villain in a Bond movie. The plan was simple: nuclear dominance. The US had bombers, and they were working on submarines, but they wanted a third option. Something undetectable, something unkillable. They wanted Project Iceworm, the idea, to burrow thousands of miles of tunnels inside the Greenland ice cap and hide 600 Iceman nuclear missiles down there. The missiles would be constantly moving on underground trains, like a nuclear subway system from hell. If the Soviets tried to attack, they'd be playing whack-a-mole with apocalyptic consequences. But there was a tiny diplomatic problem. Greenland belonged to Denmark, and Denmark was kinda touchy about the whole storing nuclear weapons on our soil thing. In fact, they had a strict policy against it. So, the US military did what any good guest would do. They lied. They pitched a cover story called Camp Century. They told the Danish government, hey, we just want to test construction techniques in the Arctic. Strictly science. Maybe check out some ice cores. No nukes here. No sir. The Danes bought it. And just like that, the Army Corps of Engineers packed their thermal underwear and headed to the middle of nowhere to attempt the impossible. But as the first shovels hit the snow, the engineers realized that building a city inside a glacier isn't just difficult, it's actually trying to kill you. So, how do you build a secret lair inside a glacier? You can't exactly order a bunch of concrete from Amazon Prime. It's 1,959. You are 140 miles inland from the coast, and the only raw material you have is snow. Infinite, soul-crushing snow. The Army Corps of Engineers, being the resourceful geniuses and masochists they were, decided to go native. They adopted a technique called cut and cover, but with a frosty twist. Instead of fighting the snow, they weaponized it. They imported massive Swiss snow milling machines called Peter Plows. These beasts didn't just move snow. They chewed it up and spat it out in high-velocity arcs. The plan was to dig massive trenches, some as deep as 28 feet, and then cover them with corrugated steel arches. Once the arches were in place, the plows buried them back up with snow. Within hours, the snow would harden into crete, a material almost as hard as concrete, but made entirely of frozen water. Basically, they were building a giant igloo skyscraper, but sideways. It sounds like a fun engineering challenge, but wait until you see what they decided to put inside this icebox. Once the trenches were covered, they built prefabricated wooden buildings inside the tunnels. These buildings were insulated like crazy because, remember, the walls of your town are literally made of ice. The temperature inside the tunnels was a steady, roughly 20 degrees Fahrenheit, while the buildings were heated to a cozy temperature. They built a main street over 1,000 feet long. They built dorms, a cafeteria, a chapel, and even a hobby shop. It was a marvel of engineering, a triumph of human will against nature. But there was one massive problem: power. You can't run a city on AA batteries, and hauling millions of gallons of diesel fuel across an unstable ice sheet is a logistical nightmare. The Army needed a power source that was small, powerful, and totally awesome. And this is where the US Army decided to bring the most dangerous object on Earth to the most fragile environment on Earth. The solution to the power problem was the PM-2A. It sounds like a generic droid from Star Wars, but it was actually the world's first mobile portable nuclear power plant. Yes, you heard that right. Portable. The Army shipped this thing in 27 separate packages from Buffalo, New York, all the way to Greenland. It was essentially the world's most high-stakes Lego set. If you mess up an IKEA shelf, your books fall over. If you mess up the PM2A, you turn the North Pole into a glowing parking lot. Incredibly, they pulled it off. In 1960, the reactor went critical. It pumped out 2 megawatts of electricity, enough to power the lights, the heating, and the showers for the entire base. Camp Century became the first city on Earth powered entirely by nuclear energy. This was a massive PR win. The Army filmed documentaries showing smiling soldiers, enjoying hot meals, and reading books under electric lights, all thanks to the miracle of the atom. It was the perfect scientific cover. Look at us. We are conquering the elements with science. But while the cameras were rolling on the happy scientists, a much smaller, darker group of men was working in the shadows of the tunnels. You see, the reactor wasn't just there to keep the soldiers' toes warm. It was a proof of concept. If you're going to build Project Iceworm, that massive subway system of 600 nuclear missiles we mentioned earlier, you can't run it on diesel. You need a network of dozens of these reactors buried under the ice. Camp Century was the prototype, the test drive. The Army needed to prove they could install, operate, and maintain a nuclear reactor inside a moving glacier before they asked the president for the billions of dollars needed to build the missile silos. They had the base, they had the power, now they just had to live in it. And that's when the psychological cracks started to form. Living in Camp Century was, to put it mildly, weird. Physically, it was surprisingly posh. They had hot showers, a library, and a movie theater that played the same reels over and over again. But psychologically, it was like living in a submarine buried in a freezer. There was no day or night, just the constant, electric hum of the nuclear reactor and the endless white tunnels. Soldiers called it the city under the ice, but it felt more like a space station on a hostile planet. The isolation started to get to people. You were hundreds of miles from civilization, surrounded by darkness and millions of tons of ice. And the ice? Well, the ice wasn't exactly quiet. Veterans of the camp reported that the glacier was loud. It groaned, it creaked, it popped. Imagine trying to sleep while the walls of your bedroom sound like they're slowly cracking open. Because, spoiler alert, they kind of were. The architects thought they had conquered nature, but nature was about to pull a slow-motion prank on them that no one saw coming. The engineers had calculated that the ice would move. Glaciers are technically rivers of ice after all. They flow. But the Army's top scientists estimated the movement would be slow and predictable. A few inches here, a few inches there. Nothing a little maintenance couldn't fix. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Camp Century wasn't just sitting in the ice, it was being digested by it. The immense weight of the Greenland Ice Sheet was behaving like a viscous fluid, and it was starting to squeeze the tunnels from every direction. Here's the thing about glaciers. They are heavy. Like, crush a mountain into dust heavy. And gravity never takes a day off. The engineers soon realized that the ice wasn't just moving. It was closing in. The trench walls began to bulge inward. The ceilings began to sag. The floor began to rise. The entire base was being slowly, relentlessly strangled by the ice sheet. To fight back, the Army created ice trimming crews. These poor souls spent their entire days with chainsaws and picks, hacking away at the encroaching walls just to keep the hallways walkable. Imagine your house is trying to eat you, and your only defense is a garden hoe. By 1962, the battle was becoming lost. In the reactor room, things got genuinely scary. The heavy shielding and equipment couldn't be moved easily, and the ceiling was descending like a slow-motion booby trap in an Indiana Jones movie. Pipes began to bend. Wiring began to snap. The base wasn't just shrinking, it was warping. And this is where the generals in Washington had to face a brutal reality. Their billion-dollar missile subway idea was a total dud. If Camp Century, a simple research base, couldn't survive for 5 years without being crushed, how on earth were they going to maintain 2,500 miles of precise railway tracks for nuclear missiles? A single warp in the track would derail a train carrying a thermonuclear warhead. That is what experts call a bad day at the office. So, secretly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff killed Project Iceworm. The dream of a subterranean nuclear fortress was over. But they couldn't just pack up and leave immediately. They had to decommission the reactor and get the humans out before the roof literally fell on their heads. But as they packed their bags, they decided to leave a few things behind. And by a few things, I mean thousands of gallons of toxic sludge. By 1967, the party was officially over. The ice was winning, the walls were closing in, the ceilings were threatening to pancake the scientists, and the military brass had decided that Project Iceworm was a bust. It was time to evacuate Camp Century. They packed up the valuable stuff. They They carefully removed the PM2 and nuclear reactor core because, understandably, the US government didn't want that showing up on eBay. But what about everything else? The buildings, the furniture, the sewage, the fuel? Well, the Army engineers consulted their crystal ball, otherwise known as science from the 1960 seconds, and made a bold prediction. They figured the snow would just keep falling forever. Their logic was simple. The ice cap is accumulating. Anything we leave here will just get buried deeper and deeper, eventually becoming preserved in a frozen time capsule until the next ice age. It was the ultimate sweep it under the rug strategy. Except the rug was a mile-thick sheet of ice. So, they left. Everything. They left the building standing. They left the tunnels intact. But here is the kicker. They also left the garbage. And we aren't just talking about sandwich wrappers. They left a toxic cocktail that would make a Captain Planet villain blush, assuming it would never see the light of day again. Here is the inventory of what they abandoned in the dark. 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, 240,000 liters of wastewater, massive amounts of PCBs, and, just for flavor, an unknown amount of low-level radioactive cooling water from the reactor. They turned off the lights, locked the doors, and basically said, "Smell ya later," to the Greenland Ice Sheet. They assumed the tomb would remain frozen for eternity. For decades, they were right. The snow fell. The base was buried. Camp Century became a ghost story, a forgotten relic of the Cold War sleeping silently under the snow. But there was one variable the Army engineers in 1967 didn't account for, a variable that is currently making weather headlines every single summer. Fast forward to the 21st century. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, and we all carry the internet in our pockets. But down in the ice, the ghost of Camp Century is waking up. The Army's calculation in 1967 relied on one crucial assumption. The ice will always be there. They assumed the Greenland Ice Sheet was a permanent freezer, but as we all know now, the thermostat on planet Earth has been cranked up a few notches. In 2016, a team of climate scientists published a study that made the Pentagon choke on its coffee. They looked at the melt rates of the Greenland ice shelf and realized something terrifying. The ice isn't accumulating anymore. It's receding. The study predicted that within the next few decades, possibly as early as 2090, the ice covering Camp Century will melt enough to expose the waste. We aren't just talking about seeing old buildings. We are talking about the release of that toxic cocktail we mentioned. The PCBs, the sewage, the diesel, and the radioactive coolant are sitting there, waiting to be flushed out. Once the meltwater reaches the base, it will act like a drain cleaner, washing all that 1,960-second sludge straight into the ocean. And here is where things get legally complicated. You see, when you leave a mess at a friend's house, usually you have to clean it up. But in international politics, it's never that simple. The base is currently sitting about 100 feet down. It's a ticking environmental time bomb. If that waste hits the ocean, it enters the food chain. Fish eat the sludge, seals eat the fish, and people eat the seals. The Inuit communities living in Greenland are looking at a potential ecological disaster caused by a secret American base they didn't even ask for. Suddenly, a forgotten military experiment turned into a modern diplomatic nightmare. Who is responsible for the cleanup? Here is the awkward legal situation. When the US built Camp Century, they did it with Denmark's permission. A 1951 treaty allowed the US to build bases in Greenland to defend NATO. But remember the cover story? The US told Denmark this was a science camp. They didn't exactly mention the portable nuclear reactor or the plan to turn the island into a missile sponge. So Greenland is looking at Denmark saying, "You let them in." Denmark is looking at the US saying, "You didn't tell us about the toxic sludge?" And the US is looking at the treaty saying, "Hey, the contract says everything we leave behind becomes property of Denmark. No returns, final sale." It is a mess. Cleaning up Camp Century isn't like picking up litter in a park. You have to excavate millions of tons of ice in a freezing, remote wilderness, locate crumbling tunnels that are likely crushed and full of radioactive sewage, and ship the waste out safely. The cost? It is estimated to be incredibly high, potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. Nobody wants to pay that bill. But while the politicians argue over who writes the check, the scientists found something else down there. Something that changes the story from toxic waste to history-altering discovery. In a weird twist of fate, the very same ice cores the Army drilled back in 1959, the ones they took just to make their science camp cover story look real, were recently rediscovered. They had been lost in a freezer in Copenhagen for decades, mislabeled and forgotten. When modern scientists opened these old army samples in 2019, they found something that shocked them. They didn't just find ice, they found dirt. And in that dirt, they found leaves. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. The US Army went to Greenland to build a weapon of mass destruction. To hide that weapon, they drilled ice cores as a fake science experiment. 50 years later, that fake science ended up proving something monumental about climate history. The soil found at the bottom of those forgotten ice cores contained fossilized plants, twigs, moss, and leaves. This was a bombshell. It meant that Greenland wasn't always covered in ice. In fact, sometime within the last million years, Greenland was actually green. This discovery terrified climate scientists. Why? Because if the ice sheet melted away completely in the recent past, when global temperatures were only slightly higher than they are today, it means the ice sheet is much more unstable than we thought. The Army's accidental sample proved that the Greenland ice sheet is fragile. If it melts again, it won't just release the Camp Century sewage. It will raise global sea levels by 20 feet, drowning cities like Miami, New York, and London. So, in a weird way, Project Iceworm might have actually saved the world by warning us about the disaster it tried to hide. The US military unknowingly provided the best evidence we have for how sensitive our planet is to warming. They went looking for a place to hide nukes, and accidentally found the check engine light for Earth's climate system. But back at the site itself, the clock is still ticking. The ice is melting, the waste is waiting, and the diplomatic standoff continues. The ghost city is still down there, crushed and twisted, holding its breath. So, what is the legacy of Project Iceworm? It is easy to look back at the Cold War and laugh at the absurdity of it all. We tried to build a nuclear subway. We tried to make a spy cat. We tried to nuke the moon. But Camp Century stands out because it wasn't just a drawing on a napkin, it was real. Men lived there. They ate hot dogs, watched movies, and prayed the ice wouldn't crush them, all while sitting on top of enough radioactive material to poison a coastline. It was a monument to American engineering prowess, but also a monument to American hubris. We thought we could conquer the Arctic. We thought we could hollow out a glacier and turn it into a garage for our doomsday machines. We treated the ice like it was concrete, static, lifeless, and obedient. But the ice proved us wrong. It moved. It crushed our tunnels. And now, it is melting away to reveal the mess we left behind. Project Iceworm was supposed to be the ultimate secret, buried forever under the eternal snow. Instead, it has become a symbol of something much scarier. The fact that there is no such thing as a way. When you throw something away, it has to go somewhere. And sometimes, 50 years later, it comes back to find you. As the climate warms, Camp Century serves as a grim time capsule. It's a warning from the ghosts of the Cold War, reminding us that while political secrets might fade, physics and chemistry are forever. The ice is melting, the clock is ticking, and the bill for the world's most expensive freezer is finally coming due. And if you think this was the only secret base the US government lost track of, well, you might want to check the bottom of the ocean next.